Well, first let's talk about the most momentous thing that happened in your tenure, and that was the change of majority, the majority party in the Congress. You came in 1978.
January 79, yeah.
Yeah, so you were elected in 1978, and you were one of those Republicans who chafed at being in the minority. Not all of them did, you did. Describe for us, or tell us about, what it was for you that was so frustrating, and maybe a couple of specifics about how that was.
Well, it wasn't so much that I chafed, I guess. It was that I was in the state legislature in California, the lower house, the assembly, for 2 terms, 2-year terms, 4 years. And the entire time there was a Democratic governor, Jerry Brown Jr. And then I came to Washington, and not only was I in the minority, but my party had been in the minority for more than 2 decades. And there was a Democratic president, Jimmy Carter was in at the time. So it was an environment that I had operated in. But you have to go back even earlier than that. I went to high school and community college in Orange County, and I chose to go to San Francisco State particularly, for upper division and graduate. So I was always used to being a minority in a political context, whether it was in the poli-sci department or in the California Assembly or in the Congress. And what I tried to do was to determine whether or not ideas had a chance to prevail, notwithstanding the fact you weren't in the majority. And frankly, coming to Washington was more of a shock than I thought it was going to be.
Why?
Because in California, notwithstanding the fact that I was in the minority, I was able to influence legislation in a significant way. Elections committee, I was able to work with the chairman and get a product done. And you actually had a little bit of cross-fertilization between the parties. When I came to Washington, it was a little, I mean, I knew it intellectually, but you have to experience it to understand that you are a minority in every sense. You never get to deal with an agenda. You never get to hold a gavel. You never get to run a meeting. You introduce a bill, if it's any good, it's taken from you and incorporated into someone else's legislation as it moves forward. You have no ability to carve out a niche for yourself, either in terms of parliamentary expertise, since you're in the minority, you don't count, the majority prevails, or legislatively, because your ideas, if they appear in bill form or they're presented as amendments, get incorporated by someone else. And I just thought that we were maybe missing out on some real potential in terms of trying to get a legislative product. And of course, I spent 16 years in that situation. And I did see to what extent you could work within that environment. I was able to influence on the margin, but it could have been much more than that.
But it was a frustrating 16 years, I gather.
Well, it wasn't that frustrating. Either that or I'm awfully stubborn because I stuck around. One, because I believed we could change the environment. And notwithstanding my bread and butter committees, which were the Agriculture Committee and then the Ways and Means Committee in 1983, except for my first term on the Committee on Standards of Official Conduct, I was on the House Administration Committee, and I worked my way up from the least ranking member to the ranking member prior to our taking over.
Well, I want to ask you, how did you make your mark on that committee? You suddenly came into power, you Republicans, to the shock of many who didn't expect that change so to be so sweeping in the '94 elections. How did you, in that committee, make your mark on the way that the way that Congress operated changed?
Well, it really was very Byzantine. When I came in, you had accounts. I mean, you had a postal account, you had an office equipment account, you had a clerk hire account, you had all of these accounts with very amounts of money in them, and you would spend down. Just prior to my coming, you used to be able to take out in cash what was left. Some of the more senior members still operated in that environment. You could take your stamps that you didn't use and cash them in. It made it very difficult as we were moving into the computer age to allow for offices who wanted to be more connected. It's just really hard to imagine. There were still people using typewriters, still using carbon paper, and that if you did computer services, it was on a contracted out basis to do your mailers. You didn't have an in-house operation. And if you did, they tended to be, this will date me, a lot of the machines were Wangs, which were electronic typewriters. They really weren't computers. And that you had standalone PCs. They weren't really linked. You didn't have an Ethernet. You didn't have any of the structure that we have now. And there was no real-time connection between the Washington office and your district office. So I came in at a time when all of this was occurring. And I had a committee chairman, Charlie Rose, who was also interested in trying to make some of these changes. And he let me play a major role in restructuring the accounts so that you eventually wound up with 2 pots of money in which all of your money for running your office was in an account and mail was in the other. We eventually merged it to a single account so you could shape your office however you wanted to shape it to carry out your function and communicate with your constituents. That coincided with the interconnectability of computers and networks so that you could then not only be connected within the office or several offices on the Hill, but with your district office as well. I ran all of my case work operation out of the district office, so I didn't have those people in the Washington office, and we had an instantaneous turnaround on decisions because constituents could come into the district office and get their case work resolved immediately. It was just an evolutionary change that we wanted to be out front and promote that kind of an integrated office. And since I spent a lot of time on it, had some knowledge on it, I was allowed to make a lot of those administrative changes. I couldn't make the big ones that needed to be made. That occurred when we became the majority, and then I became chairman of House Administration in 1995, and then we made the big changes.
Yeah, that's really, talk about just a couple of the big changes that you made from that committee, from being chairman of that committee.
Well, number one, people didn't get their jobs on the basis of patronage, and decisions were made for members by exceptions to the rules. You had a rule book, but the way the chairman of House Administration used that office for leverage was to grant exceptions to the rules. And then people would come to you hat in hand, ask for an exception. You give them an exception, and then they owed you something. And so it was run by exception, 8,000 exceptions, for example, in a given session. So what I did was put a book together and said, these are the rules. And if you have a problem with the rules, if they don't seem to work, then give us the complaint. And what we will do on a 6-month basis is review the complaints and then periodically make changes in the underlying rules. But there will be no exceptions to the rules during that period. Well, of course, people just couldn't understand it because here I was voluntarily giving away significant leverage. But what it did do was put everyone on the same basis. And you know, if you really want to run a place on a quantitative basis, if you empower the bottom of the structure, it's almost as good as getting in with the upper part of the structure. So I wound up making a lot of friends because they didn't think they could do the kinds of things that senior members did, when in fact they should have, because they have a vote, they have constituents to represent, and you should have an understanding of what you can get, rather, what you can get because of your position rather than who you are within the infrastructure. So by making it more professional, by creating a standard method for change, and by consolidating the money, we really moved into the modern era of instantaneous communications, coordinations, and at the same time, since as chairman of House Administration, we oversaw, and I became chairman of the Joint Committee on the Library, we sent up one of Newt Gingrich's ideas in terms of trying to move toward a paperless Congress, try to get as much stuff online as possible. Shrink the bill room where you took dead trees and passed it out. You could go online and instantly get the text of a bill and wind up with a two-way communication. For some reason, the internet connection between the Library of Congress and Congress and the rest of the world is called the Thomas system. and it stood for Thomas Jefferson, who is obviously a major figure in American history, having supplied his library to restock the Library of Congress after the British invasion.
Well, let's talk about some of the more profound kinds of changes that happened in addition to that. They were very heady days when the Republicans first...
But let me underscore, something as fundamental as the structure of how you do business and how you communicate is pretty profound. It doesn't rate articles. People don't focus on it. But a fundamental way of doing business can be a sea change, and we'll talk about that, and you'll see it pop up as we go forward. And
the Republicans certainly were focused, and you were at the head of that, on being a much more efficiently run institution.
And taking away privilege, that was part of it. There was no patronage. You didn't get it by exception because you were a committee chairman. Everybody was treated equally.